Womack in Texas. For a number of years, I worked at a little school down the road called the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service. You might have heard of it. But anyway, seriously, Josh asked me to talk about China's military and security affairs, and what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how I think Chinese leaders see the security situation, and then discuss some of the trends that I see over the last four decades. So the title I've given to my remarks is China's Great Leap Outward and its Nested Security Strategy. So it might be abbreviated to Leaping While Nesting. And then you think, well, hey, wait a minute, China's supposed to be a dragon. Maybe it's actually a big bird. But anyone's a fan of the Game of Thrones, I think that dragons have nests, or at least they have eggs, right? So maybe I'm not so far off. But anyway, so how did Chinese? Quick disclaimer: what I'm about to say represents my own views, not those of the Rand Corporation or any of the sponsors. It should go without saying, but it's always wise to state the obvious. Conventional wisdom about China is that China's Communist Party's raison d'etre boils down to regime survival. And I think the word survival can be very misleading because it implies a great desperation or great urgency on the part of China's communist rulers. Actually, I think that China's leaders are quite confident, at least in the near term. They don't fear collapse or overthrow next week, next month, next year, although it's a good idea to have constant vigilance. That's for sure. But they're much more worried about 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. So how do you ensure that the Chinese Communist Party is still going to be ruling China decades from now? That's the big challenge that they face. So I think their top priority is more better captured in talking about regime perpetuation, continuing the regime. So it's not about how to survive in the short term, but on the medium term and long term horizons. And their obsession, as we've heard in the last panel, and even so far on this panel, is about planning and thinking about envisioning, designing, and executing big, bold initiatives, schemes, highly ambitious schemes. So I think the best way to describe Xi Jinping and his Politburo colleagues is as ambitious alarmists. And in a sense, 40 years of reform and opening, or what I like to call China's Great Leap Outward, epitomizes this ambition. So you've seen an evolution of initiatives over the last 4 decades, increasingly ambitious, and going from nationwide to global in scope. If you think about the Belt and Road Initiative. So what do I mean by nested? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the security concept that might best describe Chinese leaders thinking about security and defense is nested or layered defense. And in the book that one of my fellow panelists mentioned, China's Search for Security, Andy Nathan and I talk about 4 rings of insecurity, concentric circles. So when Chinese leaders look out their windows in central Beijing, how do they see the world? We argue that it's in terms of 4 concentric circles. The most important is that first inner circle, and that's everything within the borders of the People's Republic of China. So that's they're looking out the window to see if those workers are going to work or striking or starting to gather. So they're really concerned about the, especially concerned about the inner ring and domestic stability, internal security. And then the second ring, you go about 100, roughly 75 to 100 miles outside of the borders of the People's Republic of China, China's periphery. That's the second ring. Also, tremendous concern about trying to maintain stability or deny access to outside powers. Who might those outside powers be? One could ask. And then the third ring going out is really China's Asia-Pacific neighborhood. And then the fourth and final ring is the rest of the world. And from a Chinese perspective, sitting in Beijing, there's only one country in the world that can reach out and touch China in every single one of those rings, and you're sitting in it. And that is tremendous cause for concern by those ambitious alarmists in Beijing, that the United States has the capability to threaten China in all four of those rings. So given this level of insecurity, if you buy my arguments, then you might ask, well, why didn't the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, why don't they just lock down China, return to Maoist autarky, turn completely inward? Wouldn't battening the hatches be the CCP, Communist Party's best defense against the myriad of external threats? Why hasn't China's Great Leap outward turned into China's Great Leap inward? Or a latter-day version of the Great Leap forward, only this time better organized, better planned, and successful. But that hasn't happened. Why? I think that it's what I call the paradox of China's Great Leap outward. I think the answer is that the unofficial mantra of China's leaders is thinking locally demands acting globally. Thinking locally demands acting globally. The Chinese rulers have drunk the Kool-Aid of globalization. To sustain economic growth in China, they see no alternative for China to continue to engage with the rest of the world, and indeed not just continue, but expand that engagement, even though it makes them very uneasy, because it makes their regime vulnerable. Hence the attention to a nested security strategy. So 4 trends. Next, I'd like to talk about 4 trends that I see in security and defense in China over the past 40 years. First, I'll just list them very, very quickly and then say a little bit about each. First is the reassessment of China's security environment. Second, a redefinition of China's strategic logic. Third, a recalibration of the criteria for effective defense capabilities. And fourth, the continued prioritization of regime and homeland security. So first, what set the stage for the Great Leap Outward or Reform and Opening policy 4 decades ago was a fundamental reassessment of China's security environment, an assessment that the main trends of the times were no longer war and revolution, but peace and development. So peace and development are obviously much more conducive to economic growth, focusing on modernizing China. If you look at the speeches of Chinese leaders, documents, writings by Chinese security analysts, it's pretty clear that they still see plenty of threats out there, traditional and non-traditional security threats. And by peace and development being the main trends, what they really mean is that major great power conflict is deemed unlikely. But that doesn't mean that localized and limited war might not emerge. And so war is possible, just not big wars. And the term, of course, the PLA uses is 诸不战争. And I think it's actually hard to translate that term. In some ways, the best way to describe it is partial war, partial. It's not a full-blown war, but that encompasses what the U.S. military likes to call contingencies. And so, it's not a good idea to feel warm and fuzzy about the assessment that peace and development of main trains of the times that doesn't guarantee that there won't be conflict between China and other countries. The second trend is a redefinition of the explicit strategic logic that undergirds Chinese defense and security policy. Really, China's gone from arguing about principles or emphasizing principles, solely principles, to emphasizing national interests. So now explicitly here, it's about Chinese national interests. And I think here China, over the past 4 decades, has been evolving to state the obvious, from a revolutionary to a post-revolutionary state, and also maturing as a great power. After all, only great powers have core interests. And of course, core interest is a succinct, abbreviated way to talk about the interests to mention without having to mention Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan. So those are about core. But we also shouldn't ignore another category of interests, overseas, Haiwai. This is increasingly a daunting challenge to Chinese leaders and the Chinese military, is how do they protect China's increasing development, investments, infrastructure, and people all around the world. And some of the places these investments and people are in, and infrastructure is in, are rather dicey, unstable regions and countries. The third trend is that China's been recalibrating its criteria for effective defense capabilities. And in a nutshell, it's gone from quantity to quality. And what I mean by that is a focus on trimming the size of China's military, but making it working on making it much more powerful, much better trained, much better equipped. So between 1978, the PLA was about more than 5 million strong. By 2018, it was down to about 2 million. And we went obviously from mainly light infantry to extremely well-trained, well-equipped, heavily armed troops in 2018. Also an emphasis on a change from mass to technology. So the informatized war is part of PLA's doctrine today, I think underscores the importance of technology. And oh, by the way, why technology is even more important, because that is the key leverage that China's greatest potential adversary has, the edge on. And that's, of course, the U.S. military. Another emphasis, and that's actually a key goal of Xi Jinping's organizational reforms, is to make the PLA more joint. Meaning that the air, naval, and ground forces can actually fight well together. And just ask anyone who served in the U.S. military or anyone who studied any military knows that in any country, it ain't so easy to get your different services to fight together effectively in a conflict. So this is a challenge that's not unique to China, but given the history of the People's Liberation Army, which is actually includes all services, not just the ground forces, it's a particularly challenging transformation. And finally, continuing prioritization of regime and homeland security. According to available statistics, Beijing spends more to ensure domestic stability than it does spend on national defense efforts against external threats. So you see that first ring is the inner part of China's nest is particularly important. But despite that continued emphasis, there has been some evolution from territorial defense to defense at the borders, and now the PLA is looking more to incipient expeditionary capabilities, projecting force farther beyond China's borders. And here, another evolution is it's gone from exclusive focus on one scenario, Taiwan, to other scenarios as well. It's not to say that Taiwan's gone away, it obviously hasn't, but the PLA is thinking about other scenarios and other missions even further afield. So as another important goal behind Xi Jinping's reorganization of the Chinese military has been to increase centralization and control under the Communist Party, but also under the chairman of the Central Military Commission, who happens to be Xi Jinping. They've shrunk the number of military regions, gotten rid of the general departments, big general departments, and turned them into offices right under the direct control of the Central Military Commission. So, to wrap up, as China's Great Leap Outward continues, China's armed forces are continuing to grapple with how best to fulfill their seemingly ever-expanding set of missions, what might be called mission creep writ large. Thank you.
Brantly.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back in my native state, and a particular pleasure to be at the LBJ School again. And to listen to my colleagues about issues. I found it very stimulating to have both the retrospective located in the present. So it provides us with a more informed view of the present and our current prospects than we would normally get. Is this loud enough? No. No? Okay. I will shout. Okay. I don't know. Okay, but the first thing I think we should start with is that 40 years is a long time. Let's go back to the previous 40 years. That's 1939 to 1979. Did anything happen then? We go back to the 40 years before that, 1899 to 1939. You know, time passes. So actually, by comparison to these two previous 40 years, the 40 years that we're talking about is the 40 years without the type of total cataclysm that the previous 40 years were marked by, were defined by. And yet, the major developments of the last 40 years, of which China's development is the most striking, certainly gets attention, as well as the collapse of the Soviet Union and the general collapse of European communism. So, two events, a plus and a minus event, but no era-defining wars. And if we look at Southeast Asia, which is what we're about to look at, it looks even less changed than the rest. If we look at Southeast Asia now, is it really different from what it was in the China-Southeast Asia relationship? How different is it? In 1978, you might say that Southeast Asia was worried about China, but there was formal normalcy by that time. Countries had established relationships during the mid-70s in general, not everyone. But they also were worried about China. And now we have formal engagement, but countries are still worried about China. So, are we going to spend 15 minutes, maybe even 20, on no developments? No, by no means, because in fact, the reason it looks like the relationship hasn't changed is that we don't spend much time looking at Southeast Asia or China's relationships to Southeast Asia. And actually, the relationship has shifted fundamentally, and the underlying material determinants of the relationship have shifted fundamentally. But we and the Chinese both tend to fixate on the countries we are most exposed to. For China, it's the United States. For us, it's China. And yet, when we look back at the history of the previous 40 years, before, I looked at the second 40 years back, Vietnam in Southeast Asia was something that was misunderstood by the United States and became a determining factor in the Cold War. And became an important factor in the Cold War. So, what is going on in Southeast Asia is important. And what I plan to do is first briefly recount the political history of the relationship, then to show the shift in economic dynamics that underlies the shift, the political relationship, and finally speculate on the foreseeable future. I need a rear view mirror. Okay, so.
Stand up at the, stand over there, you can see.
Yeah, right. Well, I have my here, so. The phases of the relationship I'm going to go through very, very fast. First phase, the anti-Vietnam Entente and the isolation of Cambodia. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia and occupied Cambodia starting in December 1978, and China 40 years ago next week invaded the border provinces of Vietnam. That began a process where China's relationships with the rest of Southeast Asia, the non-Indochina, not Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, former French Indochina, but the rest of Southeast Asia improved. And they improved on the basis of an anti-Vietnam Entente and on the basis of an isolation of Cambodia. This is ironic because if you think about it, China's relationships with Southeast Asia improved because China